2006 should have been one of the great years in Hearts history. Scottish Cup winners and league contenders, but off the pitch the club was in complete chaos. On today's Currie Club, the Scottish Football Sessions, we go behind the scenes of the Vladimir Romanov era with two former captains, Stephen Pressley and Michael Stewart.
Stephen, Michael, I've been looking forward to this episode. I can imagine there's some incredible stories to be told about Vladimir Romanov, that period at Hearts. But before we get into all of what he did at the club and didn't do, just put me in context, everybody watching and listening as well. The situation at the club, if you remember it, back in 2004, 2005, when Vladimir started to buy shares, it was a precarious time, wasn't it?
It was a precarious time. The support was turning on the club. There was obviously a lot of speculation about the club's future at Tynecastle. You know, it had been put up for sale, and I think it was at the time
Callum had done a deal.
Yeah, had done a deal, and it looked like we could play at Murrayfield. So it wasn't a particularly happy club. It was quite a divided club at that time. They were obviously looking for somebody to take the club over and you know, retain the rightful place at Tynecastle.
Moving away from Tynecastle would have been an absolute disaster for the club.
They needed a saviour, as Michael says. Vladimir Romanov is a man that tries to step forward, and he's slowly buying more and more shares at this point. A lot of players started to arrive, as you know. I'm sure at that point you must have spoken to Romanov a few times yourself, and some of these foreign signings that were coming in. You start the season under George Burley in incredible fashion.
It was interesting. From the Craig Levine period through the John Robertson period, we'd built the nucleus of quite a good squad.
Yeah.
George comes in with what was his assistant, but really head of recruitment, a lad called Simon.
Yeah.
And Simon started bringing in a lot of players from the Czech Republic and various other countries. The level of the signings brought a real excitement and optimism to the club in that pre-season.
Well, they won their first 8 games that season, undefeated in their first 10, Celtic being the last, I think, of that run. I don't know if you felt title contenders. In that dressing room, did you feel at that point there's a real chance you could go on and win the title?
There was a definite feeling of optimism. You know, I think the Celtic game was a massive game. We'd also beat Rangers prior to that, you know, at Tynecastle. Yeah. So, you know, we built up an amazing degree of momentum, and also we're a really physical, strong team. And as I said to you there, we had the nucleus of a good team. We had strong personalities within the dressing room. So I did feel at that stage we had a real chance. You know, and it would have been really interesting, you know, to see what would have happened if George had remained in charge. There's no doubt that his departure really derailed us.
When did you first find out he was gone?
You know, I'd heard murmurs after the Celtic game that there was problems. And they were about his substitutions that day. You know, we'd gone to Celtic Park, we'd drawn the game 1-1, but by all accounts, after the game, Vladimir had a meeting with George and told George that if he'd made these two substitutions, we would have won the game 3 or 4-1, of course, which George disagreed with. So that was after that, and it obviously just built up over the course of the next couple of weeks. And then George departed. I remember going in on the Saturday morning prior to the Dunfermline game, getting taken into the office by a couple of the Lithuanian employees and just explained the fact. And the amazing thing was, always remember this, there was 3 Manager of the Month awards on
He'd won them all.
the shelf. He'd won them all. It was quite amazing.
The whole of Scottish football was just like, what's going on? Because we're just blowing teams away. Early goals, quick starts, dominating teams, and you know, you think to yourself, a few short months into the season, it's always been, you know, brilliant. You genuinely do look in from the outside and think, that's a team that's going to be difficult to stop. And then they sack the manager. It was pantomime stuff.
And when you say that, Michael, it was very much the George Burley way.
But do you believe George Burley had full control over the players that were coming in, what was happening around the first team? Was that a question at the time?
I think there was he had a degree of control, but I think there was a degree of compromise as well, because you had the likes of Jankowskis coming in, you had
Chesnauskas, they'd come before.
Yeah,
you know.
But that was definitely a
pressure from above.
Yeah.
Jankowskis, in terms of as a compromise, the guy had been playing at Porto. You know, he was a top player. The problem was then that was the precursor for what was to come after that. And when, you know, even when I came back, you were still being, you know, flooded with Lithuanians that were just simply not good enough.
It was a whole different regime at that point. Obviously, there was a lot of pressure from above, but Romanov came into the club as well. He obviously had a big say on signings. Yeah. But after George left, there was this period where all these names, the back page of the paper, Kevin Keegan, I think Sir Bobby Robson, there were so many names linked with the football club, top managers from around Europe. Was there also a feeling that this might end well?
There was obviously that hope, but I always remember receiving a phone call from Graham Ricks, and Graham, you know, we got on really well, but he just didn't have that presence, that kind of big manager presence.
It was a controversial appointment.
It was a controversial,
as you know.
And he was a really, really good person, a really lovely guy, but he just didn't have that presence, that charisma that I think George carried at that time, and I think the squad needed at that time.
He certainly didn't have the control, as we sort of found out later on down the years. But again, you must have heard the names that some of the candidates, Claudio Ranieri and others. Otmar Hitzfeld, I think, was one of the ones mentioned, Michael. Still, other side of the city, but you must have been thinking, what can Hearts achieve here?
You were sceptical, I would say, when you were hearing all these, you know, names. It was very much a, well, we'll wait and see. You know, and you know, it clearly did not transpire to be, you know, what you would have hoped for.
I think George was a manager he couldn't influence, and I think that's why it ended so abruptly. Yeah. And then the Graham appointment was very much this is what's to come.
In that January, I think 11 new players arrived. I mean, that was a ridiculous transfer window.
These were still...
This is a team that went on to win the Scottish Cup. It wasn't a terrible season. You finished second as well.
Second in the league.
And you win the Scottish Cup. So even although you can probably feel within the football club that chaos is reigning here, you still go on to have a good season.
Yeah. But the issues were that there was absolutely no plan in place. It was just sign players.
Scattergun.
It was scattergun approach.
You were relying on talent.
I don't know if you've ever been in the dressing room at Heriot Watt. It was a big dressing room, and this is no exaggeration. They had to add additional benches down in the shower area and in the bath area to accommodate all the players. And see, after that, we actually had such a large squad with two first-team groups. Now, how do you create a unity and a spirit within that?
Was it after the January, did you have meetings at that point with Romanov? Or you were certainly unhappy? I remember there was a lot of stories in the press that you wanted to lead almost a delegation of players to go and to speak to the board, if you want to call them the board. Was that around about that time, or was that after? Well, because I know in October, the famous press conference, but before that?
Before that, the reason that we did was to do with Graham. And he'd been treated so poorly and dictated to by those above. And it was all around the Andy Webster situation.
But you remember with Andy?
Well, they didn't want to play Andy. Yeah. He did play him, and he was going to be sacked. Right. And on the back of that, I led 4 or 5 of the more senior players to go and meet Vladimir. And
what happened?
He gave him more time on the back of that. I think he was going to sack him, and we said that this is wrong, this can't happen, gave him more time.
So he would listen occasionally to you?
To a point, but it was inevitable.
What were the conversations like, Stephen? Give us an idea, because you know the sort of image he has now.
You actually could have quite a civil conversation, and Mike will tell you that. The problem was you could have that conversation, and then the following day it was different.
I think you've agreed something.
Yeah, you've agreed something. You know, my job ended up being with a lot of the players and staff to actually go and see him, because this was a common occurrence. You'd be told something, it'd be different the next day.
You just felt like, look, if you can just let a manager, like, manage the club, there's a good team that will be able to do something. And, you know, like when I went back and eventually when I was captain of the club, as Elvis said, you'd speak to Vladimir, and I liked the guy. You'd have good conversations with him. I always felt it was others that were influencing, you know, what he was eventually doing.
The day that I left the club, you know, I got brought into Valdas's office. Actually,
well, this was Valdas Ivanauskis.
This was Valdas who was in charge,
as well.
Yeah. And I think on Vladimir's instruction, and then offered me the assistant manager's job.
This is after the famous record in 3, the press. This is now the next season, following season. You've won the Scottish Cup. This is October, I think.
Yes, this
of
is
2006.
October. Not long after I made the famous statement. I had to refuse. It went against all what I was standing for. But my point is, then an hour later, I went down to the offices at Tynecastle and were told that I had no future left at the club. And that kind of told me the situation within the club. There was an agenda. And I think that those within the offices, those that worked behind the scenes, I think they felt that I had too much power and influence, and it affected decisions that they wanted to make. And in the end, they got me out.
Take me back then to we've just mentioned the famous Rickerton three. At what point did you go and speak to Paul Hartley and Craig Gordon and others? Were you trying to make sure you had at least a couple of players, significant players, next to you on that day? How did you even go about chatting? Were they on side with you right away? No problem, we'll be with you, sort of thing?
Yeah, I'd asked several others, but I'd explained to others, actually, the likes of Robbie and those, that weren't on big money at the time, that had families, and I spoke to them, and I'd asked them, but also I'd said to them, look, it could affect your future, and if you don't want to put
that must have been hard, actually, for a lot of players.
Of course it was.
You had the support of the dressing room, but publicly it's difficult, isn't it?
Well, that's it. And I had to choose the correct ones, of course. And the reason being is it had just been a continuous, situation where, and we're not just talking at this moment in time, it was assistant manager was coming to me with his problems. We're talking about me having to deal with every aspect within the club. There's certain things that don't sit right with me on the whole thing, because I genuinely did it in the hope that they could see some sense here, because at that time it was utter chaos. When I think back at some of the things that we're doing, I remember there was almost a witch doctor came in. This was a lady that I believe that Vladimir had an illness and she had cured his illness. She would come in and on a Friday, she had this machine you'd put your finger in, right? Yeah. And the machine would tell you whether you were fit or not to play the following day. It was a great thing.
Did it take any blood or anything, or was it just...
No, just you put your finger in, right? And it would tell you if you're fit or not. A brilliant thing for the manager, because he didn't need to let people down.
Do you think
the machine says no?
Lads had already decided before the finger went in who was going to be playing at the weekend?
I think that was it.
When I came back in pre-season, it was no longer just one finger. It was like a ghetto blaster, right?
This is the following summer.
You put your two hands into where like the CDs would go, and it was the same thing. And it used to just there was like a silhouette of like your body, and then it would just go like, whoa, whoa. And then you weren't allowed to train, or you weren't like, oh.
I'd been 8.5 years at the club. I'd in place a testimonial in the following season. It had been promised to me. I probably had a career pathway there where I would have gone from being a player to being a coach and developed there. So there was a lot of things, a lot of sacrifices I made. And
do you regret doing it then?
I do, yeah. I do.
After Ivanauskas, Malioferov comes in. What was it like training under Edouard when he came in? Because obviously that was clearly the selection of the owner.
Yeah.
Did he even want the job? I'm not sure, but...
Listen, during 20 years as a player, it was probably the most bizarre training period of my life. We didn't play any small-sided games. We hardly did. In fact, we did no tactical sessions. We would go out...
Because he spoke no English.
Yeah, we would go out... We'd do star jumps, we'd do squats, we did play games, but the games were what you called, you joined arms. You had to run about in twos with joined arms, and you could only kick the ball with your left foot. And there was also wheelbarrow football. You name it, we did it.
What was the wheelbarrow football?
Your partner would have your legs. You'd be on your hands, and you'd have to flick the ball with your hands against each other.
They loved handball.
This was the end of your period at the club.
They loved handball as well. He used to play handball all the time, Malioferov. When I went back in pre-season and he reappeared, and the guys that were obviously still there, they were just like, oh my Christ, please no.
I've never seen anything like it, but this joined arm football, this was amazing. Yeah. You had to get your partner, join arms, run about with arms, and you could only use one foot. It was crazy.
So, obviously Paul Hartley, we know, eventually moves on. Craig Gordon gets his big move after it, but you're kind of shown the door, aren't you?
Yeah.
You went to Celtic. How did you feel at the time? Because you've just said you went into that press conference hoping that you might bring a degree of calm, that people might listen In the end, you're effectively pushed out the door.
There was huge disappointment for me. And I know, I obviously got a good move on the back of that to Celtic, but that certainly wasn't my intention. I'd been 8.5 years at the club. I'd in place a testimonial in the following season. It had been promised to me. I probably had a career pathway there where I would have gone from being a player to being a coach and developed there. So there was a lot of things, a lot of sacrifices I made. And
do you regret doing it then?
I do, yeah. I do. You often do things with intention and you think something's going to come of them, but you never get any thank yous for it. I put my neck on the line, and from a career perspective, well, when you go to play for Celtic, you play for Rangers, you play for Hearts, you don't become the most popular person in Scotland. That's why I don't live there anymore. But you don't, you don't, and
you've upset them all.
I've upset them all, but from what I got out of it, listen, I did it with the best intentions. I'm a guy that has very high values and morals. That's why I did it. I didn't like what I seen within the club.
This is now the football club that you are rejoining, because you signed in the summer 2007. There's a famous summer tour as well.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot you remember about what went on that summer.
I mean, it was proper, off the scale. But the other thing that just I kept clinging on to was that the calibre of player that was there.
Still.
And we're doing all these things that Elvis was talking about, and these boys obviously knew. And when Malafif turned back up, they were just you could just see them thinking, oh, please, no. And it was, in the Alps, pre-season, star jumps, forward rolls, piggyback, Cully Bucky's runding, then you had to swap over and get back. And then handball, they just loved handball all the time, and the Liths used to love it. They used to love
you were
playing.
great at handball.
Oh, great at handball. I mean, they couldn't kick the ball from here to there, but they could throw it brilliantly, half the length of the football pitch. Anatoly Korobotchka, who was technically meant to be the manager, but he didn't want to manage, you're trying to speak to Anatoly and say, what's going on?
You've experienced.
Yeah, and the boys that were obviously there before, they were like, he cannot come back. Like Malafif, it was why is he here? And Anatoly was sort of saying, well, he's the man, and he's like, no, he can't manage. Because when he'd been at Hearts, it was 9 games and he hadn't won a game.
Yeah.
We're going to play Austria Vienna. And Vlad had come to the hotel to give one of his inspirational speeches beforehand, and he was talking about how, when he was growing up, he was a wee hard man, and he used to fight, he had to scrap for everything. He was a boxer. And Roman, just Bednar, in a sort of toss-away sort of comment, was just I bet you weren't very good or something like that. and Vlad just looked at him and then just carried on talking. So you didn't think anything about it. After the game, I'll never forget, Vladimir comes into the changing room and he's got 2 sets of boxing gloves in his hand. He'd gone into the Vienna town centre, he'd bought these 2 sets of boxing gloves, and you could just see Roman's face just like that. What? And he chucks a pair of gloves at him and he goes not very good, out into the car park. So,
and by the way, the press are there, cameras are there.
Yeah, so it was behind a fence. It was still sort of inside the stadium in the car park. And Vlad's got his sleeves rolled up, he's got his boxing gloves on, and Roman's obviously reluctantly going but what am I meant to do here? So Vlad's jumping about, ready to start boxing him, and Roman's not wanting to throw a punch. And eventually...
Punching your sacked, basically.
Exactly. And eventually Vlad, catches him with a beauty.
He does.
And Roman's sort of stumbling about, and we're all going, couldn't stop laughing.
If anyone's not seen it, by the way, and they're watching or listening to this, you've got to have a look online. You see the red mist descend over Roman's eyes.
Then he quickly realises, I can't do this.
Well, someone jumps in, though. He kind of backs away.
Larry jumps in. Larry Kingston
jumps
in. But I think Larry was just he was just this is brilliant.
Yeah.
But
if he hadn't done that, though, you do wonder where that was going to end.
No, we were winding Roman up, just saying you bottled it.
After the year that we won the Scottish Cup, we flew into Monaco and stayed overnight in a hotel, and then the following day we're on the bus coming down into the marina, and there's top level yachts sitting there, and then there's almost this cruise ship, and we're all joking, saying, wonder whose that is. And of course we pulled down, it's for us. We are talking top
Billionaires
level
row.
Incredible. And we spent, that pre-season, we spent something like 10 days on
The
this.
doggies on the deck.
Yeah. But
Seriously, you were there for 10 days?
something like
On the boat?
7 to 10 days on the boat. It was only us on the boat. It was our training camp. So we spent the 7 to 10 days cruising the French Riviera, stopping off at various
It sounds
places.
great, by the way.
It was unbelievable. And just training at various camps. He kind of did things that made you think, he has some serious money behind him.
To relate back to, obviously, Webby's time where his contract was running down, that was a constant thought amongst players, was that if it was known that you were going to be leaving, then you weren't going to play type thing. And Sergei Fedotovas, who was like one of Vlad's guys that was running the club, I remember Sergei was like, right, we want to negotiate a new contract. So I was like, yeah, I'm open to it. I went into Sergei's office and he looks up and goes, I'll be back. So he walks out of the office, and he comes back with an A4 sheet of paper, nothing on it other than like 4 lines. The first one was length of contract, 3 years plus 1. Wage, appearance, bonus. That was my contract. I was like, right, I'll go have a wee think about it. I mean, that was like, it was like nonsense.
You could have stayed on.
I could have stayed, yes. Yeah. Well, if that was the contract.
If that was real.
There you go.
Was that another one of the 2 days later you never hear again?
It was just, things were just done in such a ludicrous way that you were like, what is that?
17 managers were sacked in 8.5 years. I think that's the number. I had to try and calculate it, but I think that's where we got to.
You've got to think, we were a game away from the Champions League.
Yeah.
If the games hadn't been at Murrayfield,
Yeah.
I think we'd have progressed. I genuinely feel that. We were such a strong team at Tynecastle.
It was an absolute travesty at the end, wasn't it? Because the club were left, I think it was June 2013, administration. You must have felt a club that at one point that was close to your heart as well, they were crumbling. And there was a real chance at that point the club could have gone under.
They were hours, I think, from potentially going under. And
I remember the press conference the administrators were saying.
Absolutely, it would have been an absolute travesty. But thankfully, you know, they've been taken over by somebody that has great intentions for the club. I always remember as well, Craig phoned me. I was on the bus on a Saturday going to a game with Coventry, and he actually asked me, it was about Robbie at the time. He asked me what I felt at the time, whether Robbie could certainly do the job. And thankfully I said yes.
Yeah.
You know?
You say that now.
Yeah, I say that. I say that.
Anne Budge, of course, has stepped up. It's the fans as well. You know, that's the thing now.
I was about to say that.
It's incredible.
You needed a saviour again in
Yes.
Anne Budge, but the plan she put together,
Yes.
backing the fans, putting their hands in their own pockets, Michael.
The backing that's
unbelievable
still-
what the football club managed to do at that point.
That's still happening just now. You know, it was a wonderful, plan. It was a really inventive idea. And it has worked a treat. The infrastructure in place, that's the thing that Vlad never really, he never invested in the infrastructure. So much money was spent. If it had been spent properly, I think you could have got the club fast forward to a position where they are now, potentially even further ahead, because the level of investment was astronomical.
I think you've got to remember as well, within that, he did some great things. Transfer record fee on Craig Gordon for a British goalkeeper that stood for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you mean,
Yeah.
because you saw it firsthand. But given the end, it almost feels hard to say.
He kept
absolutely.
at Tynecastle.
You know,
He did,
absolutely.
and that was the good.
Aye.
Yeah.
But in the end, it was unfortunately almost the financial
Absolutely.
ruin. So it's,
Absolutely.
there was some good, a lot of bad under Vlad. But what a story, guys! Thank you very much. Really enjoyed
Thank you.
it. Cheers, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Michael, cheers. Thank you.
BT Sport Pods.